So we had this like low daily usage, and it was really difficult to discern like what product enhancements we needed. So that one, for example, would be one that we were getting from the campus security group or campus safety or campus police or whatever, because they knew they didn't want that many false positives. So that was easy enough. So we could architecture around that kind of feedback. But to actually get like end user feedback was very challenging. In the early days of many businesses, including ours, data is at a premium. You want to take a data-driven approach to decision-making, but because of frankly low system usage or a product that may not have a ton of data, you're at a loss as to how to find data. But data is important. Having a healthy feedback loop with material data sets is crucial to your success. In episode 9 of season 3, and the first episode of our Big Data for Small Companies series, we tackle how to find data and build feedback loops for your nascent product. Hello, folks, and welcome to Startup Different. Dave, Chris, a podcast, business. Here today, we are talking about another, this has been a theme of this season. I'm not going to lie. The feedback loop. We're back to the MVP again. Somewhere like people are going to start thinking we're sponsored by Eric Ries or something like that, because we have been talking about the MVP and the feedback loop on a surprising number of things, which like it is and it isn't surprising, because on the one hand, it's like, well, you know, it's usually just for product innovation, but we used it all the time for lots of different stuff. So it does kind of add up that it's
I was born to build, measure, and learn.
Born to build it. Okay. All right. We're coming up on 4 or 5 taglines of what you were born to do. Also, that one's way less interesting.
Yeah, the most boring of all things I was born to do.
Yeah, by far. I feel like, was it you were born to freak out? I feel like was one of those in there.
I was born to be acquired.
Born to be acquired was the best.
That was the best one. Yeah.
You should, again, that should be the LinkedIn tagline. But yeah, so why are we talking about feedback loops again? Well, this is our first episode on a new series about data. And data is kind of like, you know, everybody thinks like I feel like big data was a really sexy term like 3 years ago. And then like AI happened. Everyone's like, what's that? I forgot about
big data. We've got AI now.
Yeah, we do. Super big data. It requires a ton of data. And actually, we'll talk a little bit about AI today as well. But we're trying to understand, particularly this would be like early in your startup's journey, or at least early in a product, like a new product for your company. And you're trying to understand how it's doing or how to iteratively improve it. And it's easy to look at the build, measure, learn process of Startup Different and be like, okay, all we need to do is follow these exact steps, you know, using this data, and we can build a better product. But you know, what happens if you don't have the data, or if the data sucks?
Yeah, this was a challenge that we had, because our product was, it was low frequency, high importance was what it was used for. It was a safety app. It was, if you were having an emergency, you would use it to call campus security, call for help. But that doesn't happen like dozens of times a day for each user. That only
ideally not
once in a blue moon. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, definitely.
That'd be a little bit disturbing if it was happening.
It's really bad if our product is being used a lot, because it means it's really an unsafe place. Yeah.
In a weird way, in a perfect world, our product would never have existed. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like people wouldn't have needed something like that, but unfortunately they did. And that was the reality of it. But I remember, I think back to like 2013 and in those early days when we had like a handful of customers, probably like sum total, like maybe a couple thousand end users sort of out there using the safety app at the various organizations. Remember, all the apps we made were branded to the organization we worked with. So it wasn't like the App Armor app. It was like, I don't know, Dalhousie's app, you know, DalSafe, which is a university in Eastern Canada, or, Jacksonville University's mobile safety app, for instance. And so people would download those and they would be using it. So we had some data, but it wasn't exactly a mountain of data. And we were keen to try to find new ways to improve the platform. But it was a challenge because it was used so infrequently. These low usage, but high importance sort of kinds of products that are out there. It was almost like a peace of mind product. You know what I mean, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. People liked having it. There were a lot of people that, wanted to have it on their phone just in case, God forbid, something bad did happen. But it wasn't something that was being used every day, because people don't normally, hopefully, have safety issues, safety incidents happen to them
Right.
on an ongoing basis. So it was challenging.
It was almost like you had a good analogy for this, which you like to equate it to the fire alarm thing. I think, what's it called? A plunger? I don't even know what that's called. The thing on the wall.
One of those the fire alarm like pull tab that you see, or pull handle,
pull
that
station,
you see.
pull handle.
Those like those red things. You know, I remember we were talking to like a marketing department at I think it was a university once, and they were looking at the safety app and they were saying, well, you know, it doesn't have a lot of hits. You know, and we were like, yeah, but you know, it's like people use it to call campus security if there's like a safety incident. Like not having a lot of hits is actually probably a good thing.
Or even if there's only 10 hits, but one of those hits helped save someone's life.
Yeah.
Like, is it? Yeah. I mean, we had more than 10 hits for what it's worth, but like, you know, it's like, well, these are really important, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't always get that.
That was kind of my comeback, was like, well, you know, why do you invest so much money into those fire alarm pull tabs? You don't get many hits on those either. Like maybe you should take all those down or stop putting them into buildings. Well, like you couldn't do that because I think that's fire code. But also, you know that it may not get used very much, but when it does get used, it is high importance. So it was kind of hard because, you know, obviously we're trying to implement all these best practices when it comes to starting a business and building a product and around data and that sort of stuff. But we had a product that was like really difficult to do that with because of the nature of the product. I feel like the people that invented the pull tabs for the fire alarms must have been like, did we build this right? Because not many people are using it. We're not getting much
clearly
feedback.
They must have. I bet it was a button at some point, but then somebody like put their head into it and then they're like, hey, we need like some sort of downward motion.
Yeah.
It improves it, right?
Good point.
Like Absolutely. A deliberate act that actually made it so, okay, no, they're intentionally pulling the fire alarm. You can't really do that by accident. There's even a little piece of glass, isn't there?
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. Who came up with the idea of the version of that where it's like the little hammer next to it and you have to break the glass before you can pull the fire alarm? So
all these things to try to fight false positives when they realized, it's actually just kids pulling the fire alarm so they didn't have to write their exam that day.
Ironically, though, that is one thing that we did as well. We had a lot of protections around pocket dials. Or
butt dials. All of a sudden, you butt dial campus security. They know exactly where your butt is.
So it had to be a very deliberate act in our app to actually initiate a call to the security or campus police team. Yeah.
But this is a good example though. So we had this like low daily usage, and it was really difficult to discern like what product enhancements we needed. So that one, for example, would be one that we were getting from the campus security group or campus safety or campus police or whatever, because they knew they didn't want that many false positives. So that was easy enough. So we could architecture around that kind of feedback. But to actually get like end user feedback was very challenging. You know, we had to actually go out and like solicit that feedback from end users and kind of push the departments as well to go and ask for feedback from those end users. You know, we had buttons in the app, that kind of stuff. But we're doing whatever we could. But the reality is we were just a data poor sort of organization. We just didn't have that much. So I wanted to attack this because not all products are like ours, for example. And it's actually kind of a complicated set of circumstances. So we want to talk about like feedback loops and how those are important, and then how you can actually like why they matter, and then how do we get in the loop? So how can we sort of get one going in our product, and then how AI is going to weigh in on this? And the myths here that I really want to tackle too is that, you know, as a founder, it's really appealing to be like, especially if you're making a little bit of money and it's kind of starting to get some traction, is that you want to believe like, you know, how people are using the product. Like maybe in some cases, but it varies. You really need to solicit some of this feedback, especially if you're data poor like we were. And the other thing too is that product feedback is just not going to come to you naturally if you're one of these data poor organizations. You need to go out and really, really get it, and intention, like it's a process. So, or process for those folks who like it pronounced differently. My Canadian just jumps out every once in a while. I don't know. So let's start with like the feedback loops and why they matter. So again, just for folks at home. So feedback loop. Oh my goodness, we've covered this a few times. Build, measure, learn. So to improve your product, whatever it is, you need the data. You need to measure, learn, improve it. The reality is that some products have natural feedback loops. And I thought this is pretty interesting. And then I kind of realized they're all around me and I use them a lot. And that's one hallmark of them is frequent usage. So think of your search engines, music platforms like Spotify, something you're going to use like almost every day. They're always getting better and they're actually learning in real time based on your usage of the platform and based on, in that case, like millions of concurrent users doing stuff based on user action. They can understand how to better architecture the product. Well, a lot of people are getting stuck at this stage, or the search was too broad, or what, these kinds of things. They'll know more about it, right? And I think in other cases, it just doesn't. There's just not so much. So we were in this category, but there's another common thing to think about is like what they call like dumb products, like so like lower usage products. So like I think like I would have normally said cars. Well, cars are getting really smart, especially if they're newer. But like certain appliances, clothes, and like these are not things that learn. They don't get better. You don't know if people find the shirt itchy by putting it on and not telling you anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's definitely tricky to get that feedback. Like how often have I don't know, maybe it's other people have, but I've very rarely ever submitted like feedback for a clothing company.
Never. I just wouldn't wear it. And then I would give it away and that'd be that. And that's it. As far as the company is concerned, I bought it. Right. So they think, oh, it must be great. And then all of a sudden over 6 months to a year, those sales start petering off and going down because the people who tried it for the first time they've sort of exhausted that and they didn't buy again. And then their company's toast and they'd have no idea why. Right. All it takes is adding some nice silk or something. I don't know. What's your preferred material? Cashmere? You seem like a cashmere kind of guy.
What's the other one? Velvet? To be draped in velvet.
Wait. You velvet clothing?
I think that's a Seinfeld episode. George.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Did that.
Right. Yeah. That one was right over my head. I didn't get that one, but I think of a velvet rope or something like the movie theater. But anyway, okay. So I digress. So there's also the data. There's also products that have a ton of data, but it's not actually that useful, like for broad system enhancement. So a good example is actually fitness wearables. You're wearing like your Fitbit. It's a mountain of data about you. Like you think about how much, if you ever like the Oura Ring or those sorts of things, if you look at the data that it captures about you, it's wild. Like it knows a ton about you. It knows when you should go to bed. It knows when you woke up in the night, when you were in deep sleep, when you snored, like whatever, all this stuff. But that's very user specific. It's hard to take that kind of data, that usage data, and then extrapolate it to broad system enhancements that work for everybody.
Yeah. And I use some of these fitness. I have a smart scale and a fitness watch and all that sort of stuff. And I find that a lot of times it's they're collecting the data. They're just not doing that much with it. They're just sort of giving it back to you. They're just telling you, here's your body fat percentage or whatever, but it's not really doing anything. Like I just don't feel like those companies, even though they're kind of swimming in data, they could be doing so much more. They could be saying, hey, here are some insights, at this time of the day, your heart rate is much higher than at this time of the day. Maybe
you'll have to go to the bathroom having too much 5.
Yeah. 4. Maybe you're having too much caffeine, like stuff like that, where there's not a ton of intelligence built into it at this point. I think that stuff is getting better, but at this point it's still
I wonder if some of that too, though, I wonder if it's like just like user anxiety. If you had an app that was really telling you a lot about your health, like beyond just sort of what you kind of like what you alluded to, that sort of like basic reporting, maybe you'd be a bit freaked out.
This is, I think, actually one of the reasons that we kind of shied away from some of this stuff at first, because I remember when we first launched our app, obviously we were using location services to share your location with campus security or the campus police department. And, some people would be like, would disable that. Okay. But like be outraged that the app had even asked them for that,
the permissions,
even though that's like the stated purpose of the app. Like in the description of the app, that's what it's there to do. And by the way, it failed positively. So if you didn't have location services on, you still made the call to campus security.
You could still get help.
Your location.
You can still get help. Yeah.
But we definitely, there's a lot of concerns around data privacy and what the data is being used for. And I think that was one of the things that we were a little bit worried about. When I think about our product, we probably, like tracking or logging, which buttons were being clicked and things like that. I think that's one of those things that we probably waited too long to introduce into our product because for whatever reason, we were just a little bit, you burn your hand on something, you don't really want to touch it again. Yeah. And it was kind of like that with a lot of the user tracking data and that sort of stuff. We kind of wanted to stay away from that. And I think, we were working with universities, colleges, healthcare. So these were kind of like sensitive markets to data and how data was being used and that sort of stuff.
Also, like after some of that like Facebook stuff came out, I want to say in 2016 or I can't even remember. Yeah,
exactly. The Cambridge
Analytica, like that stuff. Then it became like it was a really different world for basically everyone. Suddenly everyone was Facebook. Suddenly our intention was to sell your data and do all these nefarious things with it. In reality, we would explicitly say both in the app and in our contracts with our customers that we would never do anything with the data other than for use of operating the system. So if you were going to make an emergency call, we would tell the people at the school, assuming we had the data, because in some cases we didn't even collect this information, but we would tell them this is, David Singleton, and this is their position.
Yeah, we had like a revolutionary revenue model. A price.
Well, it's because, it was free. Yeah. The data, from in the eyes of the end user, it's another one of those free services. And people were starting to learn that when something is free, you're the product, right?
Yeah.
Except in our case, because it wasn't actually free. We were charging the school like just a straight, monthly fee. And that was that. But the end user, it was kind of bizarre. We had a bunch of stakeholders, right? But the end user didn't have that visibility. So they would assume we were up to no good,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it was challenging. But by the end of it, though, we had like an opt-in data collection option where it was actually collecting like anonymously what buttons and icons were being tapped in the app. Mm-hmm. So we could kind of get a sense of like, hey, on this main menu, this button at the bottom is like the highest tapped button. Maybe we should move it to the top. Like those
that would never happen for what it's worth. It was always the top
pretty good,
that were,
but sometimes we were surprised where there were ones that definitely needed to be promoted up that list and be more visible, higher, above the fold, rather than, kind of buried down further.
Yeah, which you could obviously do in our content management system, just for what it's worth. So it was actually very trivial for the customer to actually do that kind of stuff for what it's worth.
But anyway. Very insightful. So we started getting better at it, but we were not good at it when we first started. So it took a while to get our sea legs on it.
Yeah. So we kind of digressed there a little bit. That was good, but let's talk about we know we need these feedback loops. So how do we get them? How do we get these things going? Mm-hmm. And we found an article on this to get better customer data, build feedback loops into your products by Andre. I'm going to butcher this. Hadju and Julian Wright. And so it's an HBR article. Again, we love HBR if you can't tell already by this point in the podcast, but we do also look at other sources, but sometimes they tend to aggregate good stuff. Anyway, whatever. But so they had kind of a few ideas as to how you can do this. So if you have a product right now, here's a framework you can kind of consider. So in the first case is like literally modifying the product. Okay. So that the usage of the product is like gives you direct insight, so you'd have to have just going at this, you'd have to have a certain volume of end users and probably more regular engagement than what we were seeing, for instance, with our product. But like people going into it, I don't know if it's daily, but it's definitely more often than weekly. Let's just put it that way.
I think this is what we were starting to do actually by the end, where we actually did implement those tools to be able to collect some of that usage data and make better insights from it.
Yeah, so but I'm talking about like volume too, right? Like even if you're collecting the usage data on 25 end users,
right?
Like, it's not statistically significant for you to actually you're not going to make that many decisions based off of that. But I do hear you. Otherwise, then capturing that data and being able to do something with it is important. But the idea, I think it's also more just sort of like you want to get it kind of like in the flow, the flow of the product, like the way that it's being used. But in any way, it's obviously kind of tricky because if you're just making the product now, okay, there might be ways that you can make this kind of a modification. But if you have a more mature product, this just might not be on the table for you,
right?
Right. And again, like us, we didn't function that way. We didn't have that kind of, it wasn't for that. It wasn't something you go in and you checked every day. It would be super annoying if it was. Like the whole idea is that you had it was a peace of mind option on your phone and you could get help when you need it. It would always work, but you certainly weren't going to call, campus police every single day or submit a suspicious activity report or, do the friend walk, like share your location every day with contact in your phone. It just wasn't something you're going to necessarily do. You wouldn't need it all the time. So that was the first idea. It was kind of like, okay, put it in there, which is a challenge. It's not going to work all the time. The other option is, can you integrate with something else? So I found was kind of interesting. So integrating with something else and then like compare the data with the activity in your product. So these like large language models, so the AI stuff sort of integrates with like Salesforce or Word or whatever, and then it'll see what content's being used, and that's how it's going to try to provide those suggestions for you. So if you're in Microsoft Word nowadays, or really any kind of program like that, and you start typing, you can see it's going to start suggesting the end of the sentence or the end of the email. Or if you're writing code, right, in Copilot in GitHub, like the idea is it's going to try and suggest what it thinks you're trying to do. And that's based off of sort of this, like a huge amount of aggregate data, and sometimes coming through integrations with other pieces of software. So that's an interesting idea. But this is kind of tricky, I would say, for a few ways. Like, Chris, can you talk about the fun world of integrations?
Yeah, don't love integrations.
Rock solid, right? Like they never break, no problem. You know,
annoying.
Like even sorry, go ahead.
One thing I was going to say though, just thinking about this and thinking about our business, one of the things we probably should have explored a little bit further is that being that we didn't have a ton of data in any one single app, but we did have over 350 apps, and I wonder if in aggregate we could have gotten to the point where we could identify some of those patterns and find best practices across them.
Like, yes and no. I think we probably could have, definitely we would have had some sort of insights. What would have been complicated is that every app was kind of different.
Yeah.
And what about things like, there's all these other factors. So like, remember the brand is of the organization. So it's front and center. So if it was at UCLA, for instance, it was the Bruin Safe app.
Right.
But if you compare that to perhaps a two-year community college and its brand equity, it might be kind of a different model.
At the same time, it's all based on the same set of modules. Like our software was all modular, right? Mm-hmm. So we probably could have like standardized some of that across the board and said, okay, now if we take all the aggregate usage across the average of these apps, like we know that, hey, this is going to be the most popular feature, so that should be front and center. Those types of questions might have been able to answer if we had the foresight to kind of figure out a way to, because it wouldn't have been easy because it was a content management system as well, but come up with some way to kind of harmonize or standardize across the board on those different modules, and then look at the metrics coming off those modules in aggregate to make recommendations to improve the product and get those feedback loops going.
That's interesting. I mean, the thing for that is, so just in this example, they were talking about like integrations with like third-party systems. So in that case, we're talking to ourselves, and definitely we probably could have done a better job of that. Just being straight up, we probably could have done a better job of that.
Absolutely.
But I remember, I think about when we were doing the sort of the COVID-19 functions, vaccine passports and self-assessments, we were often taking that data because we were the front end effectively. We were really good at the end user facing piece because we had created and actually this was through a lot of feedback with end users and with the organizations we were working with. We created a really easy, like kind of hold your hand process to getting through a self-assessment or a vaccine submission. But then the data for that was all going to the school, to the back end, this back end system, whether it was like Tableau or something like that. And we didn't have, like, once it was there, it was gone. But I would have been interested in like having some sort of integration to see what kind of like patterns are they seeing? What kind of analyses are they doing? And was there something else we could have gained from that too?
Yeah, I think that was our fitness tracker phase where we were essentially collecting a ton of data. We were getting every user or every student at the campus would be using that every day, and we would be sending that data back to the university through a data feed, and they were pulling it into a business intelligence type of application to figure out what they had to do with it. But we were just the ones giving the data over and kind of handing it over to the institution so they could do what they needed to do with it. We weren't really trying to derive any insights from it at that point, other than some basic things like, was there a bug and like the data came in weird or something like that. That was really all we were looking for, is just to make sure that the data was clean. But we didn't really think of much beyond that from that perspective. And then unfortunately, or fortunately, the pandemic came to an end and that all stopped. so we kind of had
a pretty solid fortunately there, bud.
We had our big data like, year and a half, and then it just disappeared.
It was pretty wild. Pretty wild time. And then so we had building the feedback loops or modifying your product. We had the integrations of the third-party systems. The other option was just kind of going right at the customers and just asking. And this was really our go-to in the early days. We usually ended up asking the buyers, which was the campus safety personnel, as opposed to the end users, simply because campus safety was more engaged and they were paying. So that's going to obviously affect your product development sort of pathway, or I don't want to say roadmap because of some other discussions we've had this season. But that's the idea, is that just go right at it and ask them. But you might have to incentivize this behavior too. So the author suggests, you want to incentivize the feedback. So for us, we did actually provide either, like, if they gave us good feedback, we probably would build it because we'd see aggregate benefit, whatever the idea or suggestion was. Or in some cases, it was even just like hard cash. That was usually more focused on like recommendations. Like it's a little bit different, but the idea was, if we got feedback, there was usually something in it for the customer that was or customers that were helping us. So, and then there was one final note here that I wanted to hit on too, because we can't have, I feel like there's gonna be a lot of mentions of AI as we talk about data and all this pattern recognition stuff. So it's cool is that, and the authors talk about this too. And I mean, I think people would intuitively sort of know this, is that AI is really helping us quickly see patterns that we as normal humans that can't read the internet in a month, like the whole internet, that we can't pick up quite as quickly. And so I think that's interesting, but also not surprising is that while the consensus is that AI is good, and a part of the process is that you just still need real humans. Real life humans,
some curation of those suggestions. Absolutely. Yeah.
And in the catch-22, right, for any of those large language models to work, you need a lot of data. So in the early days, I don't think this is super feasible, because the AI will give you effectively like aggregate recommendations, possibly based on your industry or your vertical or whatever. But it's going to take time for it to really effectively hone in and work for you and your end users, because your product is new. So how is it going to really know about how any of this works?
Yeah. So tread lightly.
Tread lightly, very carefully.
Review carefully. Yep, absolutely.
So data is good, but your product may or may not be generating enough of it, or like useful data that you can actually action in aggregate. You want these feedback loops. They are very, very important. We talked about them all the time. There are options to make these feedback loops that we were just talking about. The absolute worst case, or best case, depending on how you want to attack this, is, just try asking your customers. Otherwise, it's a very deliberate process, but you're essentially looking for ways to, again, collect large amounts of data.
As a new startup, we definitely weren't doing a great job at this. But my recommendation would be stick with it. It's worth it. You just need to push yourself to find those feedback loops that you can generate. And they're probably going to be places, obviously, you didn't think of in the first place, somewhere different. So
somewhere
keep at it.
Different. I also would say that it's like market specific too. Like our market did, but didn't really care because of the whole fire. Once we explained the analogy around the fire pull station thing, most of the time they're like, oh yeah, maybe it's not as important as we kind of thought, but so it is still market specific. So we just didn't put that much time into it early.
Yeah, I agree.
And then last thing is, AI is also here, can help, but can also hurt. Make sure you're curating it. So last very important point there too. Yeah. Any closing thoughts, Chris, or is that it?
Oh, that's pretty much it. I wish we had started earlier in this whole process and really from the get-go, made this part of what we were thinking about. Our next startup, I will definitely be into this much earlier in the process.
What are we doing?
I don't know. Do you have an idea yet?
No, I'm pretty idea poor right now. I'm not gonna lie. Maybe a podcast.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, on that note, folks, thanks so much for joining us. This was episode 9, Feedback Loops and Data Goldmines, first in our Big Data for Small Company series. Please rate the pod, follow us on social, say nice things to us, or whatever, or maybe just come see us, come say hi, and we'll see you next week with our next episode in this series. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us. If you like what you heard, subscribe to and rate Startup Different in your favorite podcast app. If you want to see our radio faces, check us out on YouTube at Startup Different and look us up on social. We're probably there if you are. And lastly, do you want to feature your startup on the show? Reach out via our website, startupdifferent.com. See you next time.